It's pretty clear about what took place here, about Russian involvement in efforts to hack information and to have an impact on American democracy. But this was an aggressive action taken by the senior leadership inside of Russia, and America has an obligation, and the CIA has a part of that obligation to protect that information.
I would consider the principal threats to start with Russia, and it would certainly include any nations that are looking to intimidate nations around their periphery, regional nations nearby them.
It has invaded the Ukraine, including the taking of Crimea, and supported Syrian forces that brutally violates the laws of war. Our NATO allies are right to be alarmed at a resurgent Russia.
President-elect Trump's nominees to run the Pentagon, the CIA, and the State Department appearing to contradict at times Mr. Trump himself when it comes to our relationship with Russia. Defense nominee General James Mattis also telling senators in no uncertain terms that our military is not strong enough to confront increasing global threats from Russia and China. James Kirchick is a fellow with the Foreign Policy Initiative. He's also the author of an upcoming book, The End of Europe, and has reported from all over the world. James, I'm curious, we played a little bit of sound, a smattering of sound from these long hearings. What stands out most to you about what we heard this week?
Mostly was the contradictions from all three nominees on what America's relationship should be with Moscow, and you compare it to what Donald Trump has been saying. Donald Trump wants to be friends with the Russians. He thinks that they're potential allies in the war on Islamic terrorism and all sorts of other issues. Yet here you had these three nominees for very senior positions saying that they think Russia is an adversary, it's an international lawbreaker, and it's not a friend of the United States. And so I thought that was pretty remarkable.
Donald Trump also thinks it's remarkable, and he actually tweeted about it this morning. He said this on his Twitter account: all of my cabinet nominees are looking good and doing a great job. I want them to be themselves and express their own thoughts, not mine. Does the diversity of opinion from what we've seen publicly strengthen the incoming administration or weaken it?
I mean, I think if it's allowed to continue in the actual governance of the country, if Donald Trump allows his cabinet secretaries and his CIA chief to basically pursue the policies that they've been recommending when they were testifying, I think that could be a good thing. But it would require Donald Trump basically, giving up and reversing himself on really one of the few issues that he's been consistent on for several years, which is this belief that the United States can be friends with Vladimir Putin's Russia. So I think we're actually going to see some potential heads banging between the president and maybe his defense secretary, CIA director, secretary of state, if he really sticks to this belief on Russia, and he's going to be disagreeing with them very strongly.
Who do you think is right? Who's on the right side of that issue?
Oh, well, I absolutely would agree with, what General Mattis said, certainly with Congressman Pompeo. I think Russia is, as Mitt Romney said 4 years ago, I think it is America's #1 geopolitical foe. I think that they are basically on every issue around the world, we are at cross purposes with them. And they are currently trying to destabilize Europe and our allies in Europe. There are several very important elections this year in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France. And I think we should anticipate seeing some really serious meddling, hacking, all the sorts of techniques that they used in our election. They will be put to use in Europe, and they're going to be put to use to bring to power anti-American and pro-Russian governments.
Wow, that's something to watch. I noticed that you didn't mention Rex Tillerson in the names that you mentioned that you agree with. I want to play a little bit of sound from Rex Tillerson's hearing, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
I would not use that term. I understand there is a body of record in the public domain. I'm sure there's a body of record in the classified domain. And I think in order to deal with a serious question like this,
Tillerson, what's happening in Aleppo is in the public domain. The videos and the pictures are there.
Fully informed before advising the president.
There's so much information out there. It should not be hard to say that Vladimir Putin's military has conducted war crimes in Aleppo, because it is never acceptable, you would agree, for a military to specifically target civilians, which is what's happened there through the Russian military.
Why didn't you mention Rex Tillerson as someone that you agree with as far as what we saw this week?
Well, I'll say two things. One, I agree with Senator Rubio that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal and Russia is committing war crimes. That said, I'm not really sure if this is something that the Secretary of State should be declaring, even before he's been confirmed. I'm not sure how diplomatic that is. So I would actually be more sympathetic to Rex Tillerson in that exchange that you just played. That said, the reason why I'm a little hesitant about Mr. Tillerson is because he spent 41 years as the head of, or working for an oil company. And the values and the skill set that you learn in that job is frankly different from what you need when you're Secretary of State. His job at ExxonMobil was to drill for oil and to strike deals, oftentimes with dictators. When you're Secretary of State, you need to consider our democratic alliances, the importance of NATO, human rights. There are all sorts of other considerations that come into play when you're America's top diplomat, and I'm not really sure that Rex Tillerson is the best man for the job in that sense.
I guess it depends on how you look at his experience at ExxonMobil. You described it one way. Some may say, well, he was the head of a big team that was supposed to create value and accomplish a goal. And some could say it's the same thing for the State Department. He's representing a big team. He's supposed to create value for the shareholders, which is us, the citizens. So it could be a difference of the way that you view his time at ExxonMobil. But I have to ask you about experience, because you have experience overseas. And when I was watching Senator Rubio and Mr. Tillerson go back and forth, I asked a question about how often Senator Rubio had ever been in Russia. And I have no record of him even traveling to Russia once. Now, you don't have to be on the ground to ask questions. I know that, certainly. But what do you think of just experience, of Rex Tillerson having experience abroad and interacting with people of power?
I think he definitely has a lot of experience, and I'm not going to begrudge him that. I think he might be more fit for, Commerce Secretary than perhaps Secretary of State. I just think that we don't want to conflate business interests and see American foreign policy as being basically just one giant business transaction. There are other considerations that we have to have. For instance, when Donald Trump, he complains a lot about our NATO allies not paying us enough. You know what? It's true that most NATO allies don't pay enough for their defense. That said, I think that NATO is vitally important, and our alliances are so important. They are more important than however much money is put into the alliance. You can't put a price tag on peace and prosperity in Europe for 70 years, which is what we've had because of NATO. You can't put a price tag on peace and prosperity in Asia since the end of World War II that we've maintained because of our military forces there. So I fear this sort of obsession with money and transactionalism. I think we really need to get back to the importance of values and what those play.
As you point out in your piece in the Washington Post, James, that a lot of our NATO allies fought alongside with us in Afghanistan and otherwise. And it's easy to forget that because we don't talk about it a lot. Just a final question for you quickly, because philosophically this is where we're at with whether or not we're with Russia as an ally or against Russia when it comes to one movement inside our country, and that is the conservative movement. And one of the things you pointed out in that piece is that there seems to be this thinking that we could align with Russia against Islamic terror. And you say that's seductive but wrong. And I want to let you talk to our viewers a little bit about why you don't think that works.
Well, there are two main reasons. One, I would say, is that Russia's approach to combating Islamic terrorism is basically mass murder. And you can look what they did in Chechnya in the 90s and the early 2000s. I mean, murdering tens of thousands of people, leveling the city of Grozny. It's not a successful strategy. It just inspires hatred. The second is I don't think that Russia actually wants America to succeed. And they have been accused of aiding and abetting the rise of ISIS by basically funneling Chechen terrorists into Syria. They withheld information, if you recall, before the lead up to the Boston bombing. Because one of the brothers, maybe even two of them, traveled through Russia to Chechnya in the years before, and they withheld that information from us. So I don't think, to say that Russia can be a friend and an ally of the United States, you have to assume that they want to cooperate with us and they want America to succeed. That's the underlying basis of an alliance. And I don't think Russia, as it's run by a bunch of old KGB guys, wants the United States to succeed in the world. They have a zero-sum view of global affairs, and they want to bring us down and hurt us.
That's a really interesting point, and it's one we're going to be talking a lot more about, I think, James. Great to have you on the program. As always, look forward to having you back. Thank you.
Thank you.